January 2009. A man walks the canal banks near Vero Beach, Florida, in the slow heat of a winter afternoon. His name is James Kennedy. He hunts fossils. Today, he picks up a piece of darkened bone the size of a finger. He puts it in his truck, drives home, drops it into a cardboard box, and forgets it for almost a year. One evening, he pulls it out again. He wants to clean it. Warm water, a soft brush, ordinary work. And then he sees them. Lines, cut into the surface. Lines he didn't put there. Lines someone else cut, long ago. He turns the bone in the light. A leg, a back, a curled trunk, the figure of a mammoth in profile, etched into the bone of a mammoth, by a hand 13,000 years dead, and almost no one knows it exists. The fragment is real, 15 centimeters of fossilized bone, from an animal that has been extinct for more than 10,000 years. The engraving is real, verified by labs in Florida, Indiana, and the Smithsonian. Cut into the bone while it was still fresh, which means the artist worked at the end of the Ice Age, sometime around 13,000 years ago, maybe a little earlier, which makes this fragment the oldest known artwork ever found in the Western Hemisphere, the oldest art in the Americas. For most of the 20th century, the textbook story was simple. Ice Age cave art was a European thing. Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira, bison painted on stone walls in Spain and France, lions, horses, reindeer, the first art of our species, the book said. Then a retired amateur in Florida washed a piece of bone in his kitchen sink, and the textbook story cracked. Over the next 20 minutes, we'll follow that crack, from a Florida canal to the labs that proved him right, from a single mammoth carved in profile to an entire lost tradition of American Ice Age art we will never see, and to the question this little bone makes impossible to avoid. What else are we missing? What else has not been seen? This is the story of how the oldest art in the Americas was found by a man with no degree on a beach, and how, 15 years later, almost no one outside a single quiet room in Florida knows that it exists. Late Pleistocene Florida, 13,000 years ago, is not the Florida that any of us alive today would recognize. The sea level is lower. The coast sits miles to the east of where the modern shoreline begins today. The climate is cooler. The air is drier. The Florida peninsula is open grassland savanna and scattered dry pine. Mammoths walk through it, mastodons, giant ground sloths the size of small cars. The full megafauna of late Pleistocene America. The land that will one day become Vero Beach is not yet beach. It is a river system inland from the coast, springs and floodplains cutting through dry savanna, a reliable water source in an otherwise thirsty Ice Age landscape. Animals come here to drink, people come here to hunt. The river edge is the place to be. We know this because of what they left behind: bones, stone tools, the wreckage of meals taken long ago. The Old Vero Site is one of the oldest archaeological sites in eastern North America, layer after layer of Ice Age life. It was first excavated in the summer of 1916 by a Florida state geologist named Elias Sellards. Sellards found something the establishment was not ready to accept: bones of extinct animals tangled with human remains. He said something radical for the year 1916. Humans had been here in North America during the last Ice Age. The Smithsonian dismissed him. The official line said humans came to the Americas late. Sellards must be mistaken. That official line would not crack for another 40 years. Sellards was ignored. The Vero finds went into storage. We now know Sellards was right about the site. It is genuinely Pleistocene. Old Vero is a real Ice Age locality. But for most of the 20th century, the Old Vero Site was a footnote, a controversy nobody wanted to reopen. Then, in 2009, an amateur named James Kennedy walked the canal banks just south of the original dig site. The Florida he walked through was not the Florida Sellards had excavated almost 100 years before. Modern engineering had reshaped it. Drainage canals had cut deep into the old riverbed. Pleistocene sediment was lifted back to the open Florida air. Bone fragments, teeth, pieces of an ice age washed out by 20th century engineering. Fossil hunters worked these canals constantly. Kennedy was one of them, self-taught, patient. He had no degree. He had a sharp eye and time on his hands. He picked up the small, dark bone and did not notice anything unusual about it. Just one piece in a day's collection. It went into his truck, into a cardboard box, into the back of his garage. Forgotten for nearly a year. When he finally cleaned it, the lines came up clear. A mammoth, carved into mammoth bone. Then his real problem began. Because before anyone could call this fragment the oldest art in the Americas, they had to prove it was not a fake. Kennedy himself did not believe it at first. He took the bone to friends, to other collectors, to scientists. The first reactions were skeptical, polite, cautious. Nobody wanted to embarrass him by getting excited too soon. Because the default assumption, when someone shows up with a piece of bone carrying a clear figurative image, is forgery. Forgery is the easy answer. It is almost always the correct answer. Bone is soft. A modern knife cuts cleanly. Most carved fossils that turn up in the United States are tourist pieces, made recently and sold at roadside flea markets. If this bone was real, it would be the oldest piece of representational art ever found in the Western Hemisphere. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. So the scientists ran the bone through every test they could think of. This is the kind of story that takes decades to nail down. Slow science, patient labs, the opposite of what goes viral. If you want more of these forgotten stories, the ones that textbooks skipped over, stay with us. There are many. Back to the bone. The first lab was the Florida Museum of Natural History in Gainesville, in Central Florida. Scientists there examined the engraving under high magnification, looking for any sign of modern tooling on the cuts. Modern engravings show clean cuts, with sharp, recent edges, and no patina inside the lines. This bone showed none of that. Inside the engraving, the lines were rounded, worn, slightly mineralized. They looked old. But looked was not enough. So the bone went to the University of Florida Geology Department. Scanning electron microscopy, element mapping by trained specialists. Then to a research lab in Indiana, specializing in dating ancient organic material. Then back to Gainesville for re-examination. And then to the Smithsonian. 3 different teams, none of them in contact with each other. Independent verification across institutions. The decisive test was something called rare earth element analysis. The chemical fingerprint left by ancient soils. Bones absorb trace elements from the soil they sit in. Different soils leave different elements, different chemical fingerprints over time. The chemical fingerprint inside the engraved lines matched the chemical fingerprint inside the bone itself, precisely, which meant only one thing. The engraving had been cut while the bone was still fresh, before deep mineralization. Not last year, not last century. The artist cut these lines when the mammoth was still recently dead, which placed the act of engraving in the late Pleistocene, the end of the last ice age, around 13,000 years ago, maybe a little more recent, maybe a little older, but unambiguously ice age, made by an ice age hand. The lead scientist on the verification team was an archaeologist named Barbara Purdue at the University of Florida. She had spent her career on prehistoric Florida. She knew the territory. She knew how easy it was to be fooled. She was, in her own words, a hard skeptic. She wanted this to be real. She refused to want it too much. In 2011, after 2 years of testing, she published the verdict in the Journal of Archaeological Science. The title was direct. Earliest Art in the Americas, an incised image of a proboscidean on a mineralized, extinct animal bone. Proboscidean, the broader family that includes mammoths and mastodons. The bone came from one. The engraving showed another. The field accepted it, slowly, carefully, with the kind of professional caution that takes years to relax into certainty. A few skeptics remained. They wondered about the surface chemistry, about the sample size, about possible contamination in storage. But no alternative explanation held up. The engraving was old. The artist was Pleistocene. The animal was real. And Kennedy, who had picked it up off the ground and washed it in his kitchen, was vindicated. But proving the bone was old was the easy part of the verification. Proving what the engraving actually meant was harder. Because if there was one piece of Ice Age figurative art in Florida, the obvious question was, where is the rest? If a Paleo-Indian artist had carved a mammoth onto a piece of bone 13,000 years ago, they had practice. You don't render a mammoth in mid-stride in confident profile on your first attempt. Nobody does. The Vero Beach engraving is a finished work. The hand that made it had done this before, many times before, which means there was a tradition, a practice, a school of sorts, a way of carving learned and passed down. An entire artistic tradition stood behind this one fragment, and we have almost nothing else from it. Almost nothing. A few ambiguous pieces in museum drawers, never properly tested, a handful of contested finds across the continent. But no body of work, no surviving sculptures, no painted hides, no carved wood, because the medium betrayed us. European Ice Age art survived because of where it was made. Deep inside limestone caves, sealed off, dry, dark, stable. Chauvet survived because a roof of stone fell across the entrance and held the cave shut for 30,000 years. Lascaux survived because of the same accident, a natural seal, a constant temperature, an accidental archive. Altamira survived because the chamber was tucked deep into a hillside in northern Spain, out of the weather, out of time. These are the survivors, a handful of caves. The full Ice Age art of Europe was many times richer than what we have. Most of it was on rock outside, in wood, in hide. None of that survived. We have what the limestone protected, nothing else. Now apply the same logic to North America. The continent has fewer suitable limestone caves for that kind of preservation. The Paleo-Indian way of life moved across open country, river edges, savanna, forest, not deep cave systems. If they made art, they made it on what they had: bone, carved wood, hide, the materials of a hunter-gatherer life. Stone tools survive. We have thousands of them. The art on stone tools is mostly absent. They were working tools. Bone survives sometimes, in dry caves, in cold permafrost, in the right kind of sediment under the right conditions. Wood survives almost never. 13,000 years of humidity, of insects, of bacteria, of fire. Wood goes. Hide survives almost never. Tanned or untanned, it does not last. Painted hide vanishes inside a few centuries. Which means this: if there was an entire artistic tradition in Ice Age America, it would look exactly like this. One bone fragment, pulled out of a Florida canal. The only piece we have. The rest gone before anyone alive was born. Some scholars now believe the Vero Beach engraving is the visible tip of something enormous, mostly invisible to us. An entire artistic culture, working in materials the continent could not preserve. A tradition we lost completely. What we lost might have looked like this: painted hides hung in shelters, carved wooden figures, engraved antler, all gone. Mammoths in profile, bison, cats, birds. The animals these people hunted and feared and respected. All of it gone. All of it except this one piece of bone. Which raises the harder question: how much of the rest of human prehistory looks like this? How much was made in a medium that didn't make it? Cave art in Europe is famous because cave art in Europe survived, not because it was the only art of the period. It is entirely possible that the richest Ice Age artistic cultures on Earth were not in Europe at all. They were in the places we cannot see because the materials there rotted away. Africa, Asia, North America. The Vero Beach engraving is one tiny window into that lost world. One piece of evidence that the rest existed. And there is another problem, a quieter one, a problem of looking. A problem of what archaeologists expected to find. For most of the last century, when archaeologists searched for Ice Age art in North America, they searched caves, because that is where European art was found. They looked for cave paintings. They did not find any. And they concluded that there was no Ice Age art in the Americas. The conclusion was wrong. The looking was wrong. Engraved bone fragments sat in museum drawers, uncatalogued, untested. Some still do. Most never will be. The Vero Beach piece was almost in that drawer. It was almost lost. It was almost just one more piece in a box. If Kennedy had not washed it, if he had not held it to the light, if he had not looked twice at the lines, we would still believe the textbook story. And the man who broke that story did not have a degree. James Kennedy was not the first amateur to rewrite archaeology. He will not be the last person to do it either. In 1940, 4 French teenagers followed their dog into a hole in a hillside. They had found Lascaux. In 1939, a farmer in Suffolk, England, dug into a mound on his land. He found the ship burial at Sutton Hoo. In 1879, a young girl pointed up at the ceiling of a Spanish cave and said, "Look, bulls!" She found Altamira. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd threw a rock into a cave near the Dead Sea. He heard a clay jar break. Some of the most important discoveries in archaeology were made by people with no training, no funding, no expectation. Kennedy belongs to this lineage, a self-taught fossil hunter who walked a Florida canal at the right time. He sold the bone to the Florida Museum of Natural History for a modest sum. He did not get rich. He did not want to. What he wanted was for the bone to be studied, properly, carefully, by people who knew more than he did. It is now displayed in a small case inside the Florida Museum of Natural History on the campus of the University of Florida. You can visit it. Most days, almost nobody does. There is no line, no crowd. It sits there, quietly. It is 15 centimeters of darkened bone behind glass. A label beside it gives the basic facts. Most people walk past. Most people who walk past have never heard of the Vero Beach engraving. They do not know what they are looking at. It is, by current dating, the oldest known artwork in the Western Hemisphere. And there is no fanfare, no crowd, no exhibit, which is the strangest part of this story. We tell some history loudly. Other history we leave in glass cases, in quiet rooms. This is the kind of history we keep telling. If you have followed us this far, you already know why. Stay with us. Kennedy himself, last we knew, kept walking the canals. He kept hunting. He never claimed to be a scientist. He claimed to be a man with time and a sharp eye. He claimed to be someone who picked up bones, which turned out to be enough, because the labs did the rest. The science did the rest. The bone did the rest. What he gave the world was the moment of recognition, the moment in his kitchen, the moment he saw the lines. Without that moment, the engraving stays in the canal mud, or in a private collection, or in a box in a garage. With that moment, it ends up in the Journal of Archaeological Science. And the textbook story has to change. The story is still changing, slowly. Most general histories of the Americas still do not mention the Vero Beach engraving. Most still describe Ice Age art as a European phenomenon. We hope this video, in some small way, adjusts that. Look at the map of North America in your mind. What do you see between 15 and 10,000 years ago? Most of us see empty land, a few scattered hunters, maybe a mammoth, maybe a spear, mostly silence and ice. That picture is wrong. There were tens of thousands of people on this continent. They had languages, they had stories, they had technology. They had spiritual practices we cannot reconstruct. They had art. We just lost almost all of it. The Vero Beach engraving is no curiosity. It is a witness. It tells us the loss was real. The world was full. Full of people who looked at mammoths the way Europeans looked at bison. With awe, with intention, with craft. Full of artists who carved animals into bone, into wood, into hide. Some skilled, some apprentice. All of them gone. On a piece of bone, in a glass case, in Gainesville, Florida, the proof that the continent was never empty. The oldest known art in the Americas is not on a cave wall. It is on a fragment of fossilized mammoth bone. Found by a retired man on a beach, verified by labs, almost no one knows it exists. The fact is the fact. If you have followed this far, you now look at the map of Ice Age America differently. There are people there. There is art there. There is a tradition there, a culture. Most of it is lost. The bone tells us it was real. We will never recover the wood. We will never recover the hide. We will never see the rest of the work. But we know it was there. One engraved bone is enough. One fragment is the difference between an empty continent and a full one. The textbook said there was no Ice Age art in the Americas. The textbook was wrong. A man in Florida washed a bone, and the textbook had to be rewritten. Slowly, quietly, without much announcement. Most of us still have not heard. The continent was never empty. The continent was full. Of people. Of stories. Of art we will never see again. But we know it was there because of one finger-length piece of bone in one glass case in Gainesville. Next time on this channel, we go back to Florida, to a sinkhole filled with water, miles inland from the modern coast, where divers found mastodon bones with butchering marks, 14,500 years old, older than Clovis, older than the textbook used to allow. Found, again, by people with patience, time, and a willingness to look. Until then, stay curious. The continent has more to tell us, and most of it is still hidden in the ground.